They stand at the edge of continents where river mouths spread their fans into the sea, and tidal flats breathe in and out with the moon, and they look across water that narrows the world into a band of shimmering distance. In this present, coastlines are longer than they are today because ice holds vast stores of seawater in high latitudes and on mountain shoulders, drawing shorelines outward and revealing shelves of sand and mud where kelp forests sway. Yet the deep channels between island arcs remain as they have for millions of years, never drying, always separating. This is the stage on which early people learn the rhythms of wind and current, the appearance of reefs at low tide, and the routes of fish that flash along estuaries at dusk, and in these places they shape their days to the sea's patient tempo. They gather shellfish on rocky points and watch for the shadow lines that betray a drop-off, and they strike flakes from stone that hold an edge against fiber and bark. They keep fires that smoke softly in the lee of dunes, fire that dries kelp char's shell and hardens wooden points. And they walk the long boughs of beaches between headlands as if measuring time by the curve of a bay. On some headlands, the wind is constant, ready to comb through hair and brush smoke toward the horizon. And they learn that such wind tends to coincide with white flecks that move across the water in traveling rows. A sign of strength they read without numbers. The sea offers regularities that become familiar, predictable tides. Seasonal swell, the turning of the sky's river that helps them orient along coasts, and from these patterns they learn where shorebirds nest, where driftwood gathers, where edible seaweeds and mollusks recover after storms. Their camps leave modest signatures, charcoal in thin lenses. Shell fragments crushed underfoot, fish bones where fires once glowed, and these signatures settle into dune and cave evidence that scholars read millennia later to place people at the literal edge during colder climates. A consensus fact endures here: during the last glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago, global sea level lies roughly 120 meters lower than today, extending continental margins into broad plains while leaving certain oceanic straits like those separating Sunda from Saihul permanently open. Even when the world's ice relaxes and shorelines retreat landward, the memory of these earlier coasts remains in submerged terraces and ancient beach ridges now far offshore. On other coasts earlier still, people approached the sea with tools that carry the precision of habit: ground ochre for marking surfaces, microliths mounted into composite points for cutting fibers, and stones warmed in hearths to bake foods. A lesser-known detail rests in beads and ornaments that travel. Marine shells appear at sites well inland, carried from shores many dozens of kilometers away, suggesting exchange routes that weave land and sea into a single corridor of movement and memory. On beaches facing archipelagos, eyes pick out the paler line of an island that rises at dusk when refraction and humidity sharpen its outline. And they notice seabirds commuting in straight lines between known nesting cliffs and a place beyond the horizon. At night, the sky offers its constant map, and though these people leave no words for their rules, they move with modern human minds that track seasonal patterns and can imagine places they do not yet stand upon. The earliest boat leaves almost no trace for archaeologists, because wood fiber and pitch do not endure the grinding of waves and the abrasion of sand, and because so many ancient launch sites now lie beneath water where shorelines drowned after the ice withdrew. This creates a durable uncertainty. The form of the first craft remains unknown. Perhaps a lashed raft of driftwood and cane. Perhaps a hollowed log encouraged by controlled fire and scraped with stone. Perhaps bundles of reed sealed with resins drawn from trees that grow in brackish backwaters. What exists instead of hulls are consequences. Stone tools and pigments found on islands that never connect to mainlands. Even at the lowest seas and settlement sequences that begin shortly after people first appear in wider regions. From these consequences, a path emerges toward later crossings, the most famous leading ultimately to Sahul. Yet here at the threshold, the emphasis is on learning coasts, intimately mapping channels by the behavior of watercolor, recognizing where a line of ripples crosses a smoother field, reading the drift of foam as a current's handwriting. In coves protected from swell, they test buoyancy of logs and the flecks of bark peeled from certain trees, and they braid fibers from inner bark and beech nettles into cords that resist salt. They discover that a closed bundle is more stable when weighted low, that a platform built above wet logs keeps fire embers safe, that a torch can survive a short crossing if shielded from spray, allowing flame to start again on the other side. The planetary scale is always present. Monsoon belts shift position with orbital cycles, upwelling zones. Strengthen or relax storm tracks, slide latitudinally, and global glaciation tightens or loosens the line between land and sea, changing the distance to an island not by moving the island, but by breathing water into and out of the world's basins. The unresolved mystery persists in motive, whether the earliest passages arise from deliberate outward exploration, from the logic of scanning for new shellfish beds and following birds, or from chance rafts torn from riverbanks in flood with people clinging and then landing where currents set them down. Some scholars argue that repeated arrivals and the speed of occupation in distant lands imply knowledge-guided crossings, while others note that winds and currents can conspire to send a drifting platform reliably toward particular chains. What stands beyond debate is that the mind that reads tides and constellations is the same mind that shapes points and chords, and that such understanding is sufficient to treat the sea as a continuity rather than a wall. They move along coasts in stages, sections measured not in leagues, but in familiar landmarks. A rock shaped like a tooth, a cove where certain shells grow thick, a freshwater seep behind a dune, and over a season the distance adds quietly until a new line of land looks less like a rumor and more like a destination. By then they know where to gather resin to seal seams, which fibers resist rot, which wood trims cleanly with a flake, and which splits. The scale of their world expands without fanfare. A chain of literal journeys becomes a corridor spanning hundreds of kilometers each day, a local movement, the sum a profound shift in range. Stone tools brighten in cemented beach deposits that later erode. Hearths leave char that persists in thin black threads, and fish otoliths settle into cave sediments above high tide marks. This edge of world setting, quiet in its detail, frames the first steps toward open water. No proclamation, only the steady accumulation of practice, so that when the time comes to leave a shore with the intent not to hug it but to cross toward a line of darker blue, the knowledge required already lives in the gestures, the materials, and the memory of patterns repeated. They step from sand onto something that floats. They push through shallows where eelgrass trails like ribbons, and they angle toward the wind shadow of a headland. Because they have learned that water there is less troubled. What happens beyond the headland belongs to later sections of this story. Yet its possibility is born here before the water's edge, where people attend to a patient sea and allow it to teach them the first logic of crossing. The sea narrows the horizon into a shifting band where shapes sometimes rise and fade. And on clear days, certain outlines seem to hold their form. A pale line that hovers above the shimmer of heat and swell, hinting at land beyond the reach of wading. A presence made visible through atmosphere and refraction. Early humans stand on these shores with their fires burning low, their footprints pressed into tidal sand, and they watch birds fly in disciplined paths, straight out across water toward destinations unseen. These lines of flight mark direction more clearly than any ripple suggesting that islands lie beyond, though the exact distance is hidden. What endures in the record is indirect stone tools found on island platforms where no land bridge ever connected, flakes scattered among caves and terraces on Timor, Flores, and other islands within Wallacea, each tool proof of a passage across salt water that never withdrew even when ice sheets locked the world's water far from these tropics. This fact that humans reached islands which remained oceanic in character forms the first hard evidence that the sea did not confine them. One lesser-known detail emerges from the presence of pygmy elephants, giant rats, and unique reptiles that inhabited such islands long before human arrival, species found only because seas had isolated them for millions of years. Yet these faunas meet hunters who carry fire and stone their existence, confirming that a crossing was made by people with deliberate movement, rather than by gradual drift of land. The unresolved question is whether these crossings are intentional, whether people set out knowing islands lay across the horizon, or whether they were swept away by storm and flood and then survived to establish themselves in new landscapes. Some scholars suggest that repeated settlement over tens of thousands of years implies planning because accidental arrivals alone could not account for the sustained presence of people in Sahel and across Wallacea. Others argue that currents and seasonal winds might have favored unplanned journeys, where rafts or debris carried survivors along reliable pathways. Both positions remain open, for the organic remains of vessels are absent and no words are left from those who undertook the passages. The scale of Earth at this time sharpens the picture. Glacial cycles hold sea levels lower, yet still the gap between Sunda and Sahel remains too deep to close channels spanning tens of kilometers at their narrowest, a distance greater than a day's walk, but crossable by water if buoyancy and balance can be mastered. The idea of scale extends further. The sweep from mainland Asia toward Australia covers thousands of kilometers. Yet broken into steps, each island a stepping stone separated by channels, it becomes manageable across generations, though each single leap demands knowledge of tides, sky, and courage to leave sight of land. The presence of ochre fragments and shell beads on islands further suggests that those who came did not arrive empty-handed but carried the material traces of symbolic life, implying intention and memory rather than random drift. Some beads discovered far inland on Sahel carry shells known only from coastal zones, showing that people transported reminders of the sea into interior landscapes, preserving connection to the water they had crossed. The planetary canvas underscores this setting. Monsoon winds blow seasonally across the equator, shifting with orbital patterns, generating predictable intervals of favorable sailing or drifting conditions, while ocean currents wrap around island arcs and gyres that can direct floating bodies across channels. These forces are immense, stretching beyond human time, yet humans find ways to read and use them without writing, noting when birds depart, when surface foam drifts in a certain way, when stars rise over headlands in consistent alignment. The camps that once stood on these islands leave their own muted records, layers of charcoal shells split for meat stone chips from tool making, the ashes of fires that lit evenings when people looked back across the water toward the faint line of the continent they had left. Archaeologists read these traces not as stories but as sequences, this hearth above that shell layer, this flake below this ash lens, and from them piece together the unfolding of occupation. A lesser-known site on Flores preserves evidence of controlled fire and stone tools dating back more than 100,000 years, associated with an earlier hominin species, Homo floresiensis, indicating that crossings of water may predate modern humans entirely. A deeper mystery still debated. If small-bodied hominins reach such islands, then the capacity to float across water belongs to multiple branches of humanity. Not just the lineage that reaches Sahul, and the implications stretch outward. Seafaring may not have been an invention once, but many times in parallel. Scholars debate whether rafts of bamboo could survive such journeys, whether bundles of reeds sealed with pitch might carry families, or whether driftwood rafts from river floods might have sufficed. What is missing is material, for water destroys rope bark and wood, leaving only stone as witness. Yet the very presence of people on Sahul around 65,000 years ago confirms that passages happened regardless of method. The mystery lies in the intention. Were these people setting out in groups with provisions, watching for the moon's pull on tide? Or were they scattered survivors lucky enough to land on beaches where fresh water pooled? What can be said without uncertainty is that the sight of islands in the distance must have pressed itself into memory, recurring with each clear day, creating a persistent question for those who lived at the water's edge. They could not know the scale of the world, but they knew horizons, and horizons promised continuity of land somewhere beyond. Stepping into that unknown required the patience to study seas, to test floating logs, to notice patterns. And in doing so, they transformed what looked like separation into a pathway. This pathway, invisible on maps today, tied together Sundawala, Sia, and Sahul in chains of experience, with each island bearing the evidence of arrival in chipped stone and buried fire. And so the outlines seen from shore, sometimes wavering, sometimes clear, become more than illusions. They become destinations, shaping the rhythm of human dispersal in a world where ice and ocean together dictate what is possible and what remains forever hidden. The shaping of wood begins quietly, not as invention struck in a moment, but as the steady refinement of gestures that accumulate along riverbanks and coastal forests where driftwood piles after storms. Early humans already carry the skill to split branches, scrape bark, and twist fibers, and in these settings they explore how certain woods float more readily than others, how green timber holds water and sinks while aged, dried trunks ride higher on the surface. Evidence does not preserve the first boats themselves, for organic matter vanishes under waves and centuries. But archaeologists infer their existence through indirect remains. Stone adzes found in layers associated with coastal livingware, traces on flakes that suggest scraping of wood, and experimental work that shows fire hollowing a log can transform it into a vessel. A consensus fact anchors this image on islands like New Guinea and Borneo. Stone adzes dating back more than 20,000 years appear in contexts where woodworking was practiced intensively. And by analogy, many scholars argue that similar techniques must have been present much earlier, when the first crossings into Wallacea were achieved. A lesser-known detail comes from residues of resins and bitumen found on artifacts in Southeast Asia and Australia. Substances interpreted as adhesives or sealants, which could also have been used to waterproof seams in wooden or reed structures. Such traces hint at an unseen but sophisticated relationship with plant chemistry, a knowledge of heating resins to change viscosity, of applying them to fibers or bark to strengthen bonds against the intrusion of salt water. The unresolved question lingers in form: were the earliest boats true dugouts carved from single trunks or rafts of multiple logs lashed together, or bundles of reeds bound into buoyant platforms? No definitive specimen remains to settle the matter, and each model carries different implications about the distance and control of journeys. Rafts are stable but slow dugouts, agile but demanding of specific timber reed boats, light but short-lived in tropical seas. The planetary perspective frames these experiments in buoyancy against wider shifts as glaciers grow, lowering seas. Continental shelves extend, and estuaries stretch seaward across new plains, creating habitats rich in mangroves and palms that provide both raw material and practice ground for boat building. The logs that float into tidal creeks are not accidents but lessons. And over generations, people learn to push them, ride them, tether them, and eventually shape them deliberately. The scale of such shaping is not only mechanical but also conceptual, for to carve or lash a vessel requires imagining a tool not as immediate extension of the hand, but as environment for the whole body, a place that can be stood upon, sat upon, and guided into unfamiliar space. The archaeological record whispers of this through distribution patterns. Stone tools of similar type appear across channels that never connected by land, and pigments, beads, and ochre accompany them, suggesting that symbolic as well as practical objects traveled with people, carried in vessels of wood or reed that did not survive. The making of a boat thus lies at the intersection of necessity and imagination, a response to horizons visible from shore but unreachable without leaving the certainty of sand. Shaping begins with fire embers placed along the length of a trunk so that heat eats into the grain, then scraped out with stone to deepen a cavity, an act repeated patiently until a hollow forms wide enough for balance. Fibers stripped from bark are twisted into ropes, cords strong enough to lash branches into rafts or tie bundles of cane. In some regions, bamboo itself serves as buoyant core, its sealed chambers holding air, and when cut into lengths and tied together, it creates a stable floating surface. These methods, reconstructed from later analogs and ethnographic parallels, show how early humans could have developed functional craft without metal or complex tools, relying instead on firestone fiber and careful observation. The scale of journeys such craft enabled is striking. A simple raft may drift with current across 10 kilometers in a day, while a hollowed log propelled by paddles of bone or wood could cover even greater distances, especially if guided by knowledge of prevailing winds and tidal flows. The planetary context is again crucial. Monsoon cycles strengthen certain wind directions, seasonally offering windows of easier passage that could be anticipated by those who observed bird migrations and the timing of storms. One lesser-known find from northern Australia dating to more than 40,000 years ago consists of edge-ground axes, among the earliest known in the world, tools that likely shaped wood for building. And though discovered far from their origin, they speak to a long tradition of woodworking that must have begun with the first crossings. Mysteries remain abundant. How many attempts ended in loss? How knowledge of successful methods was preserved, whether ritual or symbolism accompanied the launching of craft, and whether groups set out in deliberate expeditions or as families seeking new ground. The archaeological record cannot answer these directly, But the persistence of settlement across Wallacea and Sahul shows that whatever methods were used, they were reliable enough to support population movement on a continental scale. To imagine the first carving of wood into vessel is not to dramatize, but to observe the continuity of gesture hands that already shape spear shafts and digging sticks, turning their attention to larger forms, testing buoyancy, balance, and stability. The sea teaches relentlessly. A poorly balanced raft tips a seam. Unsealed lets water in a cord frays under strain. Yet each failure offers correction, and across seasons the craft improve until they carry not just individuals but groups, and with them fire tools, seeds, and memory. The first carvings of wood are therefore not merely technical but transformational, shifting the boundary of human movement from riverbank and shoreline to the open passages of sea. The absence of surviving boats leaves silence where form should be. But the scattered presence of tools, resins, beads, and bones across islands speaks as witness, confirming that carving took place, that vessels floated, and that horizons once out of reach became traversable. Thus, the carving of wood marks a profound threshold in prehistory, a technology that dissolves the final barriers of geography and renders the oceans not obstacles but corridors through which the story of humanity continues. Stone lies silent, yet it is the most durable witness to human crossings, and in scattered deposits across islands separated by permanent sea channels. Tools tell a story no waves can erase. Flakes of volcanic rock cores struck for blades and adzes, ground smooth by use, emerge from cave floors and uplifted terraces on Flores, Timor, Sulawesi, and other islands of Wallacea, each piece confirmation that people reached these places without land bridges. For even at the lowest stand of Ice Age seas, the channels here never closed. This consensus fact anchors the argument for seafaring that modern humans and perhaps even earlier hominins arrived on islands accessible only by watercraft. A lesser-known detail sharpens this point. On Timor, stone tools of a distinctive type associated with deep-sea fishing appear in layers dated to more than 40,000 years ago, alongside bones of large pelagic fish such as tuna, suggesting not only arrival but active engagement with the open ocean, a level of maritime adaptation that implies boats capable of reaching beyond reefs and into blue water. The unresolved question, however, lingers in method. Were these voyages deliberate explorations guided by knowledge of wind and current? Or were they the result of drift storms, sweeping rafts from coasts and depositing survivors who then established new settlements? Scholars continue to debate, noting that repeated occupation over millennia implies planning and skill, rather than chance alone, but no direct evidence of vessels survives to resolve the question fully. The planetary scale frames these movements during the late Pleistocene glacial cycles, lock vast quantities of water into ice, exposing continental shelves and enlarging land masses, yet never bridging Wallacea's deep straits, which remain as channels ranging from 20 to 80 kilometers wide. Distances too great to cross by swimming or wading, meaning that humans equipped with tools and fire also possess the means to move across salt water. The scale is immense when compared to daily movements on land crossings longer than the span between the Seine and the Thames, or from one mountain valley to another, now undertaken across surfaces that provide no footing and no fresh water. Yet people do it as stone on distant shores testifies. The tools themselves bear the marks of journeys, lithic material not native to islands where they are found, implying that people carried stones across seas to fashion implements where local resources were lacking. Some assemblages show continuity with mainland tradition, suggesting cultural transmission alongside movement, while others develop distinct local forms, evidence of adaptation once isolation set in. Beads and ochre accompany these finds, symbols that travel as readily as cutting edges, and their presence on islands underscores that these crossings were not accidental exiles but the migration of entire lifeways. One site on Allure reveals not only flaked stone but traces of pigment, use a subtle reminder that symbolic practices, body painting, ornamentation, or ritual marking cross the water alongside practical skills, and in this we glimpse the full humanity of those early sailors. The absence of wooden hulls or paddles is a silence imposed by taphonomy. The destruction of organic matter in tropical soils and shifting coasts. Most launch sites now lie submerged beneath meters of water as shorelines drowned when ice sheets retreated after 20,000 years ago, burying any remains beneath sediment and coral growth. Thus, archaeology must reconstruct vessels indirectly from the presence of people where they could not otherwise be, and from the fishing practices that demanded more than wading and nearshore foraging. The presence of tuna bones in particular is decisive, for such fish cannot be taken from the shore. They require boats that can withstand swell and venture beyond the sight of reefs. The mystery persists how many people first set foot on these islands, whether in single crossings or successive waves, whether carrying firebrands or kindling new flames from friction. We cannot know the names they gave to places or the stories they told of water, yet their traces endure in the stone, the shell, the bone. The planetary environment surrounding these events is dynamic. The Indo-Pacific warm pool generates monsoons, trade winds, and equatorial currents that shift in strength with glacial cycles and orbital variations. El Niño and La Niña alter rainfall and storminess, sometimes creating more dangerous seas. Sometimes calmer passages, cycles that humans must have learned to recognize through generations of observation, even if not by our terms. Such planetary rhythms set the conditions for risk and opportunity, making the difference between favorable winds that carry rafts toward visible land and currents that sweep them into open ocean. The scale of these crossings is not only physical but temporal. Each successful arrival leads to generations of habitation, the establishment of families, the creation of sites that layer shell and bone into middens. Evidence that accumulates over millennia until unearthed by archaeologists who piece together fragments into a narrative of movement. Each flake of stone, each fish bone, each charcoal lens tells part of a larger story of seafaring adaptation. A lesser-known observation arises from obsidian volcanic glass, prized for its sharpness. In some parts of Melanesia, obsidian artifacts show long-distance transport across water. And though later in date than the first Sahul crossing, such evidence demonstrates the continuity of maritime skill that began with those earlier voyages. The implication is that once water was crossed successfully, it became a medium of connection, rather than a barrier, a pathway along which not only people but materials, ideas, and symbols traveled. The mystery remains unsolved as to whether the very first crossing into Sahul was intentional scouting or accidental drift. But the cumulative evidence points toward planning, repeated occupation, large game hunted soon after arrival, and continuity of tool traditions argue for groups moving with purpose, not just chance survivors. In this way, the stone tools found on far shores stand as markers of both capability and imagination. The durable signature of hands that struck flakes and cores, carried them across channels, and used them to build new lives in unfamiliar landscapes. These artifacts remind us that technology and movement are inseparable, that each chipped edge and worn surface is a testimony not only to practical work, but to the expansion of human range across boundaries once thought impassable. Thus, the story of the first boats remains hidden in the silence of vanished wood. But the story of their journeys endures in stone, where edges struck tens of thousands of years ago still cut into our understanding of how humans became seafarers, how islands once beyond reach became homelands, and how the sea itself entered the domain of human history. The path to Sahul unfolds not as a single leap, but as a sequence of crossings through the shifting geography of Southeast Asia during the Ice Age. A geography where lowered seas expose vast plains yet still leave deep straits that can only be passed by watercraft. Sahul, the landmass uniting Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania, waits beyond the Wallacean Islands, and evidence places modern humans there at least 65,000 years ago, meaning the crossings must already have been accomplished by then. The consensus fact is clear: no continuous land bridge ever connected Sunda, the Southeast Asian mainland, and its extended shelves with Sahul. So arrival could only have been achieved by deliberate passage across open water. The distances varied with sea level, but even at their narrowest channels required voyages of more than 70 kilometers when currents and visibility are accounted for, a formidable undertaking for people without metal sails or recorded navigation. The route itself is debated. Two general pathways are envisioned, one through the northern chain of Sulawesi, the Moluccas, and New Guinea, the other through the southern string of Timor and the Lesser Sundas toward northern Australia, and both require multiple stages of island hopping punctuated by longer open water stretches. A lesser-known detail concerns visibility from certain high points on islands like Alor or Roti. The next landmass can sometimes be glimpsed on exceptionally clear days, a faint line across the horizon. Yet the open water between them would still swallow land from view once the voyage began, meaning that travelers had to depart with confidence that land awaited beyond the empty stretch. The unresolved mystery is how such confidence was acquired, whether through systematic scouting following birds and cloud patterns, or simply trusting accumulated oral knowledge passed down across generations. Archaeological finds suggest the occupation of Sahul happened quickly after the first arrivals, implying that once one group succeeded, the pathway was followed repeatedly, consolidating into a flow of people rather than a solitary episode. The planetary scale of these events frames them within the last glacial period, when ice sheets locked water into northern continents, dropping sea levels and expanding coastal plains, creating a mosaic of habitats that encouraged movement along new corridors. Yet the oceanic barriers of Wallacea remained, reminders that planetary forces do not open all pathways equally. The scale of these passages is immense. A single voyage across 70 kilometers of open water is the equivalent of walking across dozens of valleys without fresh water or footing. But unlike land, the sea leaves no trace of the path, only the landing records it. To make such journeys required not only craft capable of floating and bearing loads, but also social organization, for boats sufficient to carry families and tools would need coordinated construction maintenance and shared knowledge of timing. It is unlikely that lone individuals drifted into Sahul and established lasting populations. Genetic studies confirm that significant groups must have crossed large enough to sustain diversity and continuity. One genetic study suggests rapid expansion once Sahul was reached. populations spreading both eastward into New Guinea and southward into Australia within a few thousand years, an expansion scale that implies initial numbers far greater than accidental survivors could supply. Archaeological traces reinforce this image. Stone tools at Majabebe in northern Australia date to at least 65,000 years ago, accompanied by ochre and grinding stones that suggest symbolic practices alongside subsistence. Fire traces and hearths confirm sustained occupation, not temporary survival, and this presence so early demonstrates that the journey across Wallacea was not an isolated accident, but a structured migration. One lesser-noted find from New Guinea reveals shell beads carried far inland, a marker of coastal origin and perhaps cultural memory of the sea transported deliberately into new highland settings, showing that the memory of crossing was not left behind at the beach but accompanied people into continental interiors. Yet, despite these insights, mysteries remain. Did the first voyagers depart in groups intentionally seeking new land, driven by demographic pressure, resource scarcity, or curiosity? Or did environmental changes such as coastal flooding or volcanic eruptions displace groups who then sought safety elsewhere? The answer is obscured by time, and only indirect hints remain in the spread of artifacts and genes. Still, the consistency of occupation across Sahul suggests that deliberate planning was involved, for random drift alone would not explain repeated success over centuries. The planetary context deepens the view. Orbital cycles tilt climates, altering rainfall patterns in the tropics and shifting monsoon strength, influencing when seas were calmest or roughest. In periods of relative stability, favorable winds and currents could have made crossings more feasible, while stormier intervals may have cut off passage for generations. Such rhythms frame the human story within larger forces, showing how migration depended not only on skill and courage, but also on conditions set by Earth's position in space. The scale of these conditions can be illustrated by comparison. While ice sheets grew and shrank across continents, lowering seas by over 100 meters, the channels of Wallacea remained fixed scars in the oceanic crust that no glacial pulse could erase. They served as both obstacle and gateway, requiring innovation and persistence. And once crossed, they transformed human range, forever extending it to the most isolated continent on Earth. The first footprints on Sahul's beaches mark the moment when people mastered the combination of wood, fire, fiber, and observation sufficiently to turn horizon into pathway, when the sea ceased to be a terminus and became instead a medium of connection. And though the boats themselves are long gone, their imprint endures in the geography of human dispersal, in stone tools scattered across islands, in charcoal buried beneath dunes, and in the genetic threads woven into the descendants of those first voyagers. Thus, the route to Sahul stands as one of the earliest and most profound demonstrations of humanity's capacity to read landscapes and seascapes alike, to adapt technologies to planetary conditions, and to extend the human story into environments previously beyond reach. The fragmented seas of Wallacea form a labyrinth of channels, ridges, and island clusters where land never fully connects to the great continents. And it is within this mosaic that early humans test the limits of seafaring. Wallacea lies between Sunda to the west and Sahul to the east, a permanent zone of water gaps shaped by tectonic collision and volcanic arcs. And because it was never joined to the mainlands, every human arrival here confirms that people mastered open water long before recorded history. This is the consensus fact. Wallacea serves as both obstacle and corridor, a place that could only be entered and crossed by deliberate voyages. Its geography is deceptive, for on maps it appears crowded with islands, yet between them lie straits, dozens of kilometers wide currents that twist unpredictably in depths plunging thousands of meters, all of which ensured that no land bridges formed even at the lowest Ice Age seas. A lesser-known detail is that many of these islands hold endemic species found nowhere else. Giant rats, dwarf buffalo, unique birds of prey, faunal evidence that they were biologically isolated for millions of years, further underscoring that human presence there must have come across water. The unresolved question is the exact sequence of crossings. Did groups follow a northern path, leaping from Sulawesi through the Moluccas to New Guinea, or a southern route through Timor and onward to Australia? Or did they use both at different times depending on climate and current? Archaeology preserves scattered signals on each pathway, but no definitive chain yet proves the sequence, leaving debate open. The planetary scale frames Wallacea as a tectonic jigsaw, one of the most volcanically active regions on Earth, where eruptions build islands only to erode them back into sea, and where earthquakes shift coastlines suddenly. For early humans, this meant a dynamic environment of fertile soils, abundant forests, and unpredictable hazards, one that both offered resources and demanded mobility. The scale of mobility here is not trivial. To move from one island to another meant venturing across straits comparable in distance to the width of major modern seas, distances that could not be guessed at casually but had to be learned through careful attention to environmental signs. The people who reached Wallacea carried with them stone tools, pigments, and perhaps cultural traditions already shaped by life along tropical coasts. Sites on Flores record human presence dating back more than 100,000 years associated with Homo floresiensis. And though these earlier inhabitants may have crossed by means unknown, their presence indicates that Wallacea was a theater of seafaring experiments long before modern humans arrived. Later, modern humans left more durable traces: flaked stone scatters, ochre fragments, charcoal layers, and bones of animals hunted soon after landfall. On Allure and Timor, deep stratigraphies reveal sequences of repeated occupation, suggesting that people not only reached these islands but returned and established lifeways adapted to their unique ecologies. The scale of adaptation is evident in faunal remains. Giant rats appear in middens, butchered and roasted, a reliable protein source that could be hunted with modest tools. Shell middens accumulate along coasts, testimony to the harvesting of intertidal resources. And fish bones appear in layers that also include pelagic species, suggesting that fishing extended beyond reefs, requiring boats strong enough to venture into deeper water. These bones are not numerous, but they indicate knowledge of the open sea beyond simple gathering. A lesser-noted observation comes from cave art fragments on Sulawesi dated to more than 40,000 years ago, among the earliest figurative paintings known, which show that symbolic life flourished here in parallel with seafaring. Such art demonstrates that Wallacea was not merely a transit zone but a cultural landscape where people left lasting marks of thought and imagination. Yet mysteries remain. How did knowledge of crossings persist over generations? Did groups leave markers or oral traditions to guide successors across the labyrinth of islands, or was each journey a fresh venture into uncertainty? Without writing, memory had to be carried in story and observation of stars and currents, in the timing of bird migrations, and in the recognition of clouds forming over unseen land. These methods, though unrecorded, were sufficient to preserve continuity of passage, for occupation across Wallacea endures for tens of millennia. The planetary forces shaping this corridor are immense. Monsoon winds shift seasonally, currents swirl through the Indonesian throughflow, carrying warm Pacific waters into the Indian Ocean, and glacial cycles alter coastlines repeatedly. These conditions could either facilitate or hinder crossings, creating windows of opportunity followed by centuries of difficulty. To early humans, such rhythms would have been experienced as patterns of abundance and scarcity, of calm seas or stormy intervals. But across the scale of human lifetimes, they became predictable enough to exploit. The scale of Wallacea's challenge is also psychological. Unlike coasts where land is always visible, here one must leave sight of shore to reach another, committing to a space where horizon offers no certainty. The courage or necessity that drove such departures is lost to time, but the outcome is clear in the presence of stone shell and pigment on far islands. Genetic evidence supports the archaeology lineages traced in modern populations of New Guinea and Australia. Point to ancestors who passed through Wallacea, carrying with them adaptations to tropical climates, and leaving signatures of contact with archaic humans such as Denisovans, who may themselves have inhabited some islands of this region. Thus, Wallacea becomes not only a maritime corridor, but also a genetic crossroads where human lineages met, mingled, and diverged. The enduring puzzle is that no boat survives to confirm form or size, and so scholars reconstruct from indirect traces bamboo rafts, log canoes, reed bundles, each possible, none preserved. The silence of material culture contrasts with the eloquence of stone tools which speak across millennia of hands that chipped, carried, and used them in places only accessible by water. In this silence lies both frustration and wonder-frustration. That we cannot picture the exact craft that bore humanity across, wonder that the evidence of arrival is strong enough to leave no doubt that such craft existed. Wallacea thus remains a hidden proving ground of human seafaring, where the fragmented seas both tested and enabled one of the most extraordinary expansions in prehistory. The movement from Sunda to Sahul, a journey that changed the scale of human existence forever by proving that oceans, though vast, could be crossed with the knowledge and materials available tens of millennia before the first sails were ever raised. On beaches that open toward straits, traces of fire remain as thin, dark lines in sediment, mute witnesses to nights when groups gathered before journeys or after landfall. Charcoal lenses, sometimes only a few centimeters thick, testify to repeated burning at shoreline camps, the smoke once drifting across sand while people prepared food, worked stone, or perhaps readied craft. The consensus fact is that fire use is consistently present in archaeological contexts across Wallacea and Sahul, appearing in cave deposits, dune layers, and open sites dating back tens of thousands of years, marking continuity of practice that accompanied people wherever they went. Fire was central not only for cooking and warmth, but also for signaling, hardening wood, and preserving embers for travel. A lesser-known detail is that microscopic analysis of charcoal particles on some islands shows that burning extended beyond camps into surrounding vegetation, possibly deliberate use of fire to manage landscapes, flush game, or clear landing zones, suggesting that the control of fire was not limited to hearths, but extended into environmental shaping. This ability to manipulate coastal ecologies could have made departure and arrival sites more predictable and habitable, reinforcing the role of beaches as recurring hubs of human movement. The unresolved mystery concerns whether firelight itself played a role in voyaging. Did groups light torches to carry flame across water, ensuring that fire awaited them upon arrival? Or did they rely on skill with friction or percussion to rekindle it each time? Organic torches do not survive, but the practical need to maintain fire suggests that some method of transport was attempted for to arrive in a new place without flame would have been precarious, especially if conditions were wet or unfamiliar. Ethnographic parallels from later societies show the importance of preserving embers during journeys carried in shells, gourds, or clay containers. And it is plausible that similar practices began in these earliest crossings. The planetary scale of fire use frames it as part of Earth's wider system. The presence of fire alters vegetation mosaics, changes animal distributions, and releases carbon into the atmosphere, making human burning a factor in ecological processes even at these early stages. In regions like northern Australia, charcoal layers dated to over 60,000 years ago may mark some of the earliest anthropogenic fire regimes which continue to shape landscapes today. The scale of impact, from the perspective of time, is immense. Small fires on beaches accumulating into patterns that affect entire ecosystems over millennia. The experience of fire on the beach was both practical and atmospheric. Its light extended activity into night, its smoke repelled insects, and its warmth gathered groups together in places otherwise exposed. Around it, stone was flaked fibers, twisted food roasted, and perhaps stories shared, binding memory of sea and land. From an archaeological viewpoint, the hearths serve as fixed points in a shifting world, anchoring evidence of otherwise mobile lives. One lesser-noted observation comes from the study of lipid residues on stone tools, which sometimes reveal traces of plant processing consistent with cord-making or resin preparation activities likely carried out by firelight, for heat was needed to soften resins and to dry fibers. In this way, firelight illuminates not only the camps themselves but also the preparation of materials critical for watercraft construction, making the shoreline hearth a workshop as well as a hearth. Yet mysteries endure. Were these fires part of ceremonial gatherings before launches, marking moments of departure with acts of symbolism? Or were they strictly utilitarian, the ordinary rhythm of daily subsistence? Without language preserved, we cannot know intention, but the persistence of shoreline burning suggests that beaches were not transient spaces alone, but structured places of human return and preparation. The planetary forces surrounding these fires are broad. Monsoon cycles bring rains that replenish vegetation. Dry seasons allow fuel to accumulate, and tidal rhythms determine where driftwood gathers, shaping when and where fires are most easily kindled. Fire at the edge of sea and land becomes a convergence of planetary processes: wood carried by rivers, dried by sun, lit by ember, feeding flames whose smoke drifts over waters shaped by lunar tides. Thus, fire on beaches connects celestial cycles, terrestrial resources, and human practice in a single act. The scale of human gatherings around such fires can be inferred indirectly. Hearths large enough to suggest groups of dozens, middens of shell and bone, indicating repeated meals, and distributions of stone flakes spread across sand where people sat and worked. From these traces, archaeologists envision communities rather than isolated individuals, further reinforcing the likelihood that sea crossings were collective undertakings, prepared and remembered by groups large enough to sustain knowledge. Fire also intersects with seafaring directly. The process of hollowing logs often employed controlled burning, using embers to char the interior of trunks before scraping away the softened wood with stone. Such fires required skill to manage without splitting the log, and their remains, though unrecognizable today, would have been common along beaches where suitable timber was available. Resin for sealing seams had to be heated before application, another role for shoreline fires. In these ways, firelight was woven into the very making of boats, not just their camps. One lesser-known site in East Timor, Jaramalai, preserves fish bones dated to over 40,000 years ago, including pelagic species like tuna alongside hearths, showing that fire and seafaring combined to enable deep-sea fishing. Without fire to cook and preserve such catches, the benefit of reaching open waters would have been limited, reinforcing that fire and boat building were interdependent technologies. The unresolved mystery remains whether such knowledge spread deliberately between groups or developed independently in multiple places. But the presence of fire in every archaeological context leaves no doubt that it was the universal companion of seafaring life. The planetary perspective again emphasizes continuity. Wherever humans went, they carried fire, altering ecosystems, leaving charcoal and sediments that endure across tens of millennia, a geological trace of cultural practice. In the layers of caves, in the sands of dunes, in the peat of swamps, fire's residue remains more resilient than wood rope or even bone, a signature of humanity's passage. The scale of its significance cannot be overstated. Firelight on beaches marks the moments when groups gathered before stepping into water, when smoke joined horizon, when embers carried across seas ensured survival upon landing. And though the boats themselves are gone, the fires that prepared them, cooked their provisions, and signaled their presence remain in the record, quiet yet enduring fragments of light preserved in earth. Thus, the story of crossing to Sahel includes not only wood and water, but also fire, the element that binds community, shapes technology, and illuminates the unknown, its glow a constant companion on the threshold of open seas. The question of what form those earliest vessels took remains unanswered, for no direct remains survive. Yet the absence itself is instructive, forcing scholars to reconstruct from indirect traces and analogies. The consensus fact holds that no archaeological site has yet produced the hull or frame of a boat older than 10,000 years. Which means that the craft that carried people into Sahul more than 60,000 years ago are lost to decay and submersion. Organic matter vanishes swiftly in tropical soils and seas. Wood decomposes, fibers rot, and resin disintegrates, leaving only stone and bone behind. Yet these surviving materials point toward boats nonetheless, for without them the crossings could not have occurred. The unresolved mystery is the exact design, whether people employed rafts of lashed logs, dug-out canoes shaped by fire and stone, or bundles of reeds bound tightly to float high and stable on water. Each model carries different implications for speed, distance, and capacity, but none can yet be proven. The scale of possibility extends across regions, for multiple designs could have coexisted, tailored to available resources and local traditions, and the archaeological silence leaves open whether the earliest crossings were made by simple, expendable rafts or by more enduring vessels designed for repeated journeys. A lesser-known detail emerges from later Holocene finds. Tar lumps with impressions of fibers discovered at sites in the Mediterranean and Southeast Asia show that humans as early as 6,000 to 8,000 years ago used plant resins to waterproof seams in boats, and although these examples are younger, they imply a much longer tradition of sealing techniques that could plausibly have begun in the late Pleistocene. Even the presence of ochre in early Sahul sites has been considered in this light, as ochre mixed with plant gum can form durable adhesives, perhaps applied to binding or caulking, though this remains speculative. The planetary frame broadens the perspective during the last glacial cycles. Shorelines stretch tens of kilometers further out than today, meaning that any preserved remains of ancient boats now lie drowned beneath meters of sediment on submerged coastal plains. Entire landscapes of estuaries, mangrove forests, and beach ridges, ideal places for building and launching vessels, are lost underwater, creating a barrier to discovery that is planetary in scale. Underwater archaeology has only begun to explore such zones, and it is possible that traces of boats still lie buried there, though the odds of survival after so many millennia are slim. The scale of what is missing invites reflection for each crossing made successfully. Boats had to exist in multiples for trial, for error, for replacement. One can infer that many more vessels were built and lost than ever carried people across successfully. A hidden history of experimentation and failure erased by water and time. What survives instead is indirect stone adzes, suggesting woodworking residues indicating resin use, distribution of stone tools across islands, and faunal evidence like pelagic fish bones that demand seaworthy craft. Together, these strands weave a fabric of inference strong enough to convince scholars that the first boats existed even if they cannot be touched. The absence of direct remains also highlights the ingenuity required to build a vessel from wood without metal tools. Demands persistence, patience, and control of fire skills already documented at earlier sites. Fire can hollow logs, stone can smooth edges, fibers can lash components, and resins can seal seams. All technologies demonstrably present in late Pleistocene human toolkits. The boat thus emerges as a synthesis of skills rather than a sudden invention, an inevitable outcome once coastal life demanded crossing. Yet mysteries remain. Were these boats crewed by small groups or whole families? Did they carry supplies, or only the people themselves? Did they have paddles shaped deliberately, or were poles and branches sufficient? None of these questions can be resolved, though ethnographic parallels with later indigenous canoes and rafts provide models carefully applied with caution against projecting too far back. A lesser-noted observation is that even simple rafts can be surprisingly seaworthy. Experiments with bamboo bundles and lashed logs have shown that such craft can survive journeys of dozens of kilometers, if currents and winds are favorable, suggesting that the earliest boats need not have been complex to succeed. What mattered was buoyancy, stability, and the ability to carry people and fire safely to the other side. The planetary context again sets the stage. Winds and currents flow predictably through Wallacea, guiding rafts eastward under certain monsoon conditions, making accidental crossings possible, but also providing reliable knowledge once observed. Such patterns reduce the mystery of how people could set out without modern instruments for the sea itself. Provides cues in foam lines, bird flights, and wave refraction. The scale of absence. Entire categories of material culture lost underscores the fragility of organic technology in prehistory, reminding us that what is known represents only a fragment of what once existed. For every stone tool preserved, countless wooden implements have vanished, including boats that shaped human destiny. Their invisibility in the record is itself a planetary phenomenon, the product of chemistry, climate, and sea level change. Yet, despite their disappearance, the legacy of those first vessels is profound. They opened pathways into new continents, allowed humans to adapt to island ecologies, and demonstrated that oceans could be crossed with technology available tens of millennia before sails. Their absence forces us to reconstruct from shadows, but the consistency of indirect evidence makes their reality undeniable. Thus, rafts, canoes, or something unknown carried humanity into Sahel. And though their exact forms are lost, the crossings they enabled remain among the most remarkable achievements of early humans. Achievements that expanded the scale of human life from continental to oceanic, proving that water, once a barrier, could be mastered as a medium of connection. The sea is never still, and those who attempt to cross it must learn to read its patterns, to sense the difference between surface ripples caused by local breezes and the long rolling swells that carry the imprint of distant winds. Navigation without instruments depends on such perception, and the consensus fact is that successful settlement of Sahul implies some degree of knowledge of prevailing winds, tides, and currents, for accidental drift alone cannot explain repeated crossings into multiple regions of the continent. Scholars point to seasonal monsoon systems as both a hazard and an aid, for winds shift predictably each year, blowing westward in one season and eastward in another, a rhythm that early humans could have recognized by watching birds depart, by noting the direction of smoke and surf, or by sensing how waves angled against shorelines. A lesser-known detail emerges from experimental voyages conducted in the late 20th century, where simple rafts modeled on prehistoric materials were able to cross Wallacean Straits by harnessing these very patterns, demonstrating that even with minimal steering equipment, natural forces could carry people reliably if timing was chosen carefully. Such reconstructions do not prove how it was done, but they show that it could have been done without sails or advanced tools. The unresolved mystery remains whether early crossings were intentional ventures guided by accumulated environmental knowledge, or whether they began as accidents, rafts swept away by flood or storm survivors washing ashore to establish new populations. The debate continues, yet most scholars now argue that the scale of occupation in Sahul, the speed of its expansion, and the evidence of deep-sea fishing suggest purposeful navigation rather than blind chance. The planetary scale frames this discussion in broader terms. Winds across Wallacea are shaped by the Indo-Pacific warm pool, one of the largest engines of global climate, while currents flow through the Indonesian throughflow, carrying water from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean. These forces create patterns that repeat with seasonal and orbital rhythms, linking human voyaging to planetary systems that extend far beyond their awareness, yet dictate their possibilities. The scale of the challenge is immense. To leave shore and paddle into open sea is to lose sight of land after only a few kilometers, to rely on memory and observation to hold direction, to watch stars at night for orientation, and to trust that land will reappear as predicted. Without written maps, navigation must be embodied knowledge preserved in stories, gestures, and practice. A lesser-noted observation is that the flight paths of seabirds provide natural compasses for species like frigate birds and terns. Fly straight lines between nesting islands and feeding grounds. Paths visible at dawn and dusk which could guide voyagers toward unseen land. Clouds, too, offer signals, for distinctive formations gather above islands where moist air rises from forests visible from distances beyond the horizon. Such cues, though subtle, are accessible to careful observers and would have offered reassurance during crossings. Yet mysteries remain. Did groups set out deliberately in flotillas, ensuring redundancy if one vessel failed? Or did they risk journeys in single craft, trusting to fortune and skill? Without physical remains, such questions linger unresolved, though genetic evidence indicating sizable founding populations suggests that groups, not individuals, made the passages. The planetary dimension extends further. Tidal cycles influenced by the moon alter currents and straits, sometimes easing passage, sometimes hindering it. These rhythms, though not understood in modern terms, would have been observed by coastal dwellers who knew when waters rose highest, when reefs exposed longest, and when currents ran strongest. By aligning departures with these patterns, they could reduce risks and increase success, showing again how navigation was less about instruments and more about intimate familiarity with cycles of the natural world. The scale of what was achieved is staggering. To move entire communities across gaps of up to 100 kilometers without maps or compasses, relying only on knowledge of sea, sky, and bird, yet to succeed repeatedly, and to leave enduring populations that spread across a continent. This feat stands among the earliest demonstrations of humanity's capacity to integrate environmental observation into practical technology. A lesser-known case study comes from archaeological work on Alor, where fish remains dated to more than 40,000 years ago include deep-water species caught far from reefs, implying boats not only used for one-time crossings, but for sustained engagement with the open ocean. Such evidence suggests that once navigation skills were acquired, they were applied continuously, embedding seafaring into daily subsistence rather than limiting it to extraordinary migrations. The unresolved question persists. How was such knowledge transmitted? Without writing, memory had to be oral and experiential, carried in stories told around fires and demonstrations passed from elders to youth in collective practice, repeated season after season. These intangible transmissions leave no trace in the archaeological record, yet they must have been as vital as the boats themselves, for without them the skills would have faded. The planetary perspective underscores that navigation was never separate from broader environmental adaptation. As glaciers grew and shrank, coastlines shifted, altering the visibility of islands and the distance between them. As monsoon belts moved, winds changed. As ocean currents strengthened or weakened, routes opened or closed. Thus, human navigation was always a negotiation with planetary change, demanding flexibility and resilience. The scale of imagination required is perhaps the most striking: to look across empty water and conceive of land unseen, to trust knowledge encoded in birds, clouds, and waves, to step into a vessel of wood and fiber and believe it could carry one beyond the horizon. Such imagination is itself a form of navigation, guiding action as surely as the stars. In this way, navigation by wind and current, whether accidental or deliberate, becomes the invisible technology that underlies one of the most profound expansions in human history. A mastery of pattern recognition that transformed seas into corridors and made the passage to Sahul not an impossible gamble, but a repeatable journey, remembered in traces of stone, shell, and bone scattered across the islands of Wallacea. The evidence of life beyond the horizon lies in Sahul itself, in the earliest archaeological layers of Australia and New Guinea, where stone tools, pigments, and hearths appear soon after humans arrive, proving that the crossings across Wallacea were not accidents without consequence, but deliberate migrations that seeded entire continents with people. The consensus fact is that the site of Majabebe in northern Australia preserves artifacts dated to at least 65,000 years ago, including ground ochre grinding stones and stone flakes, establishing one of the oldest known occupations outside Africa and Eurasia. This site, along with others such as Nawalabila and Malakunanja, demonstrates that human settlement in Sahul was established rapidly and endured, showing adaptation to a wide range of environments from monsoon forests to arid deserts. A lesser-known detail is that footprints preserved in volcanic ash at Lake Mungo, dating tens of thousands of years later, reveal groups moving across dunes in patterns consistent with cooperative hunting or travel. Subtle traces that suggest organized social life well beyond the act of arrival itself. Such finds confirm that people not only reached Sahul but thrived there, developing lifeways suited to its unique landscapes. The unresolved mystery centers on the speed and scale of dispersal. How quickly did people spread across Sahul after first landing, and what routes did they follow into its vast interior? Genetic evidence indicates rapid expansion, with lineages diverging between New Guinea and Australia soon after arrival, implying that populations fanned out in multiple directions rather than remaining clustered near landing sites. Yet the precise pathways remain uncertain, for shorelines at that time lay far seaward of today's coasts, now drowned and inaccessible to excavation. The planetary scale situates these events within the last glacial cycle, when sea levels were more than 100 meters lower, exposing broad plains where now lies the Gulf of Carpentaria, joining Australia and New Guinea into a single continent. This landmass provided vast new habitats, but also challenges, from arid deserts in the interior to dense forests in the north. The scale of dispersal across such diverse environments within a few millennia underscores the adaptability of humans who had already mastered open seas. The scale of migration can be visualized in distance. To move from Timor to northern Australia requires crossing more than 70 kilometers of open water, but once across the interior of Sahul stretches thousands of kilometers further, demanding new forms of knowledge and adaptation. Settlement of arid zones like Central Australia shows that these early arrivals quickly developed strategies for survival far from the coasts that had first carried them. A lesser-noted observation is that some of the earliest Sahul sites preserve not only tools and pigments but also grinding stones used to process seeds. Evidence that even in this deep past, people experimented with varied food resources, laying groundwork for the complex foraging traditions that followed. Ochre found at Majabebe shows that symbolic practices, whether for body painting art or ritual, accompanied the move, reinforcing that these were not chance exiles but full communities carrying their cultural worlds with them. Yet mysteries remain. What role did fire play in shaping Sahul's landscapes after arrival? Some scholars argue that the spread of people coincides with the decline of megafauna such as giant kangaroos and diprotodons, perhaps influenced by human hunting or landscape burning, while others suggest climate change as the dominant factor. The debate remains unresolved, but the coincidence in timing places human arrival as a pivotal force in Sahul's ecological history. The planetary perspective broadens again Australia's position in southern latitudes, exposed it to unique climatic oscillations with glacial periods intensifying aridity and interglacials bringing wetter conditions. People adapted by dispersing along river corridors, occupying rock shelters, and developing mobility strategies suited to fluctuating resources. In New Guinea, by contrast, people settled in highland valleys where agriculture would later emerge, showing that diverse adaptations began almost immediately after arrival. The scale of cultural endurance is striking. Genetic studies of present-day Aboriginal Australians and Papuans trace ancestry directly to these earliest arrivals, confirming continuity of population across more than 60 millennia among the deepest unbroken cultural lineages on Earth. This fact demonstrates not only the success of the initial crossing but also the resilience of the societies that grew from it. A lesser-known archaeological discovery at Huon Peninsula in Papua New Guinea includes evidence of early exploitation of shellfish and reef resources, indicating that maritime knowledge did not vanish after arrival, but was integrated into new lifeways, maintaining continuity between seafaring past and continental settlement. Yet the unresolved mystery lingers. Did the earliest voyagers return to Wallacea maintaining connections across seas? Or did the crossing represent a one-way threshold after which populations diverged permanently? No evidence of two-way exchange survives from this early period, though. Later seafaring in Oceania centuries afterward demonstrates that such possibilities existed in principle. For now, the first Sahul crossing stands as a singular expansion, severing daily contact with Asia while opening a new world of adaptation. The planetary scale of its significance reaches into today. Australia's archaeological record preserves some of the earliest rock art on Earth, pigments layered in shelters for tens of millennia, while New Guinea's highland valleys hold traces of some of the earliest cultivation. These traditions originate from the people who first crossed seas with fire and stone, carrying their lifeways into landscapes that would sustain them across glacial cycles. The scale of imagination required is profound. To cross water unseen and then to spread across a continent larger than Europe, to adapt to deserts, forests, and highlands, to establish continuity of culture across 60 millennia. Such achievement, invisible in boats lost to time, endures in the stones, pigments, and genes preserved in Sahul. Thus, life beyond the horizon was not only survival, but flourishing, the establishment of enduring societies that remain among the most ancient continuous cultures in the world, their origins bound to the moment when people first trusted wood and fire to carry them across seas into a new continent. The shifting of climates governs the seas as much as the lands, and the story of human crossing is inseparable from the rhythms of glacial advance and retreat that repeatedly altered coastlines and the scale of journeys. The consensus fact is that during the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, global sea levels fell by more than 120 meters, exposing vast continental shelves and extending coasts outward. Yet even at these extremes, the deep straits of Wallacea and the Torres Strait remained open water, ensuring that some passages could never be bridged by ice alone. This simple truth, that parts of the ocean were permanent barriers, frames the achievement of crossing as a feat beyond the reach of glacial cycles. A lesser-known detail lies in drowned river valleys and submerged deltas that once served as launch points for voyages. Sonar mapping has revealed traces of ancient channels now buried beneath shallow seas, evidence of landscapes where early humans may have camped, fished, and pushed off into open water now inaccessible to excavation. These hidden coastal plains are reminders that much of the evidence for the earliest seafaring lies underwater, erased from immediate study by planetary change. The unresolved mystery concerns timing. Did crossings occur only during periods when seas were lowest, making distances between islands shorter, or were they possible throughout multiple climatic phases, with people adjusting to longer or shorter gaps as conditions required? Some scholars argue that intentional voyages were feasible even when seas stood higher, while others suggest that windows of low sea level created the best opportunities. The lack of preserved vessels leaves the answer uncertain. The planetary scale frames these fluctuations within orbital mechanics. Earth's tilt and orbit modulate solar input, driving the waxing and waning of ice sheets and shifting the distribution of monsoons, currents, and storm tracks. to early humans, these cycles were invisible in their causes but tangible in their effects. Changing coastlines across generations, altering the availability of resources and opening or closing possible pathways of movement. The scale of these changes can be imagined in distance. A channel 50 kilometers wide at one sea level might contract to 30 kilometers at another, reducing the risk of losing sight of land and making crossings more attainable. Yet the deepest straits never closed, ensuring that some level of seafaring knowledge was always required to reach Sahul. A lesser noted observation is that as seas fell, island coastlines expanded dramatically, exposing wide intertidal flats and lagoons rich in shellfish, seaweed, and fish nurseries. Such productivity may have encouraged people to linger at coasts, intensifying their familiarity with tides, currents, and seasonal cycles, inadvertently preparing them for eventual journeys outward. The ecological abundance of glacial coasts may thus have been as significant as the narrowing of distances. Yet mysteries endure. Did groups perceive sea level change, consciously marking the retreat of waters across their lifetimes? Or was it too gradual to notice except in shifting shorelines familiar to elders, but altered by the time of grandchildren? Without writing, such perceptions cannot be traced, yet oral traditions from many cultures preserve stories of drowned coasts, suggesting that memory of rising seas may indeed be ancient. The planetary context also includes the role of climate in shaping winds. Colder glacial conditions shifted atmospheric circulation, strengthening trade winds in some regions and weakening monsoons in others, directly influencing the feasibility of voyages. These changes, though measured today in ice cores and sediment, were felt then in the angle of waves, the timing of storms, and the directions of bird migrations, cues that early seafarers read to guide their choices. The scale of glacial landscapes is almost unimaginable from a modern perspective. Deserts expanded in continental interiors, forests retreated, rainfall belts shifted, and coastlines stretched far outward. Yet through these immense changes, humans maintained continuity of life, adapting to aridity, cold, and altered ecologies. The presence of people across Sahul during both glacial and interglacial phases confirms their resilience to planetary change. A lesser-known piece of evidence comes from genetic studies that reveal population divergences within Sahul, corresponding to climatic shifts, suggesting that environmental barriers such as deserts or flooded corridors influence the distribution of groups, shaping cultural diversity. Such findings highlight how global climate cycles played out directly in human demography. The unresolved question of intentionality resurfaces here. If distances shortened during low sea stands, were people more willing to risk crossings then, or had they already mastered techniques that rendered distance secondary to knowledge of current and wind? Experiments suggest that both scenarios are possible, leaving the exact motivation elusive. The planetary dimension underscores that the ocean is not static, but breathes with climate narrowing and widening channels over millennia. To seafarers, these changes created both challenges and opportunities, dictating when voyages were most practical. Yet the permanence of Wallaceia's straits ensured that some level of maritime knowledge was always essential. The scale of reflection this invites is vast. Humanity's first ocean crossings occurred not in a world of stable coasts, but in one of constant change. A stage where seas advanced and retreated, forests waxed and waned, and winds shifted with rhythms larger than lifetimes. In navigating these conditions, humans proved not only their technical ingenuity but also their capacity for resilience within planetary systems. Thus, the story of climates that open and close seas is not only about geography but about time, about the way long cycles shaped short lives and how people who could not know the mechanics of orbital change nonetheless adapted to its consequences, leaving footprints on beaches now drowned and tools on islands that never touched a continent. The mastery of crossing, then, is as much about recognizing the permanence of some barriers as it is about seizing the opportunities offered when distances narrowed a dialogue between human intention and planetary change that defined one of the earliest and most enduring expansions in human history. Among the most evocative traces of the first ocean crossings are not only tools and bones, but objects that speak to meaning beyond survival, for people carried beads, pigments, and symbolic items across the water, revealing that the move into Sahul was not simply practical but cultural. The consensus fact is that ochre appears at some of the earliest Australian sites, including Majabebe, where grinding stones and pigment fragments dated to 65,000 years ago show that symbolic practices such as body painting, decoration, or art were present from the very beginning of settlement. This evidence demonstrates that when people crossed seas, they carried with them more than food and fire. They carried ideas and expressions of identity. A lesser-known detail is that shell beads perforated for stringing have been found at sites in both Wallacea and Sahul, sometimes far inland, showing that these small ornaments traveled across environments and distances far removed from their coastal origins. One striking example is shell jewelry found in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, over 100 kilometers from the sea, evidence that coastal memory and aesthetic value were transported deliberately into interior landscapes. The unresolved mystery is why such objects were carried at all during risky crossings. Were they talismans, tokens of belonging, markers of group identity, or simply items of beauty? The absence of written record prevents certainty, yet their presence reveals that even in moments of profound movement and adaptation, people did not abandon symbolic life. The planetary scale frames this within the broader human tendency to infuse meaning into landscapes across continents. Ochre appears wherever humans settled, from Africa to Eurasia to Sahul, suggesting a universal symbolic vocabulary that transcended geography. The spread of these materials across oceans demonstrates that cultural practices were as mobile as populations carried across horizons along with subsistence skills. The scale of dispersal is striking. Beads and pigments move not only across islands but deep into new continents, linking coasts and interiors through trade or personal movement. Their survival in archaeological contexts offers a glimpse of intangible worlds otherwise lost. A lesser-noted observation is that the types of shells used for beads often come from species that inhabit intertidal zones collected during low tide, sometimes far from settlement sites. This detail implies that the act of collecting and carrying them may itself have been meaningful, a practice linking shorelines to memory and identity. Yet mysteries persist. Were such ornaments worn during voyages, perhaps as symbols of shared identity among crews? Or were they buried in sites as part of ritual acts after landfall? No burial older than 50,000 years has yet been found in Sahul to clarify, leaving the function of these symbolic objects unresolved. The planetary context deepens further. Sea levels rising and falling not only altered coastlines but submerged countless early sites where such objects may once have been abundant. What survives on land is only a fraction preserved in caves or higher terraces, leaving us with incomplete glimpses of what was likely a much richer symbolic world. The scale of imagination that ochre and beads represent is profound. They show that people crossing seas were not merely driven by necessity but carried with them systems of meaning, a capacity to symbolize experience that made even new and unfamiliar landscapes feel part of human order. A lesser-known case study from Sulawesi reveals hand stencils and animal figures painted on cave walls more than 40,000 years ago, among the earliest figurative art known, showing that symbolic expression flourished in Wallacea itself, not just in the destinations beyond. These artworks reinforce that the crossing to Sahel was embedded in a cultural milieu already steeped in symbolic life. The unresolved question of intention resurfaces. Did carrying ochre and beads onto boats signify preparation for ritual acts upon arrival, or was it simply continuity of daily practice? Without words we cannot know, but the persistence of such objects across sites suggests that they were integral to human lifeways, not marginal. The planetary scale reminds us that symbolic life is one of humanity's most enduring traits, arising independently in many regions, yet carried faithfully across continents and seas. In this light, the presence of beads and ochre in Sahul is not surprising, but inevitable evidence that meaning always accompanied movement. The scale of time deepens the impression for more than 60 millennia. Aboriginal Australians have maintained cultural traditions linked to landscapes, rock art, and oral histories. Continuity unmatched elsewhere, and these traditions trace back to the very first arrivals who carried pigment and ornament across oceans. A lesser-noted implication is that such symbolic practices may have played a social role in facilitating seafaring itself, for shared identity expressed in beads and body paint could have bound groups together, providing cohesion necessary for collective action in dangerous voyages. In this sense, symbolic life was not a luxury but a component of survival, enabling cooperation. Yet mysteries endure. We cannot know the stories attached to these ornaments, the songs sung as beads were strung, or the meanings painted with ochre on skin or stone. But the persistence of pigment fragments and perforated shells shows that even in the stark record of prehistory, symbolic memory endures. The planetary perspective again underscores the vastness of what is lost. Countless ornaments and pigments vanished underwater as seas rose, entire symbolic worlds erased, leaving us with fragments preserved by chance. Yet those fragments are enough to remind us that the human capacity for symbolism was carried across seas as faithfully as fire. Thus, the story of shell beads, ochre, and memory enriches the account of the first boats. It tells us that humans did not cross oceans stripped of culture, but as fully human communities, carrying not only tools and skills, but also meaning, binding their crossings to identities that outlasted horizons and rooted themselves in new continents. Each island beyond the first crossing presented its own world, a landscape of unknown plants, animals, and terrain, and in these places humans encountered environments that demanded adaptation and resilience. The consensus fact is that Wallacea and Sahul contained faunas unlike those of mainland Asia, including marsupials, giant reptiles, and birds unseen elsewhere. Ecosystems isolated by millions of years of evolutionary separation, and human arrival marked the first time these species encountered people. Archaeological evidence shows rapid shifts in faunal remains after settlement, with large animals disappearing from records over time, suggesting human impact alongside climatic stress. A lesser-known detail is that on islands such as Flores, people hunted giant rats that weighed several kilograms, animals that became reliable prey, and whose bones fill middens, a reminder that adaptation was not only about confronting danger, but about finding sustenance in unfamiliar forms. Similarly, on Sahul, people quickly learned to exploit shellfish, freshwater fish, and tubers native to the new landscape, showing that their survival depended on rapid ecological learning. The unresolved mystery is how humans perceived these encounters. Did they view the new animals as threats, resources, or spirits of the land? Without direct testimony, we cannot know yet the persistence of symbolic practices like ochre painting and bead-making suggests that the unknown was integrated into cultural systems of meaning as much as into diets. The planetary scale frames these encounters as part of a larger wave of human dispersal across the globe. For wherever people went, whether into Europe, Asia, or the Americas, they confronted unfamiliar species. And the spread into Sahul was one of the earliest and most dramatic examples requiring adaptation to a continent where marsupials rather than placental mammals dominated, where giant flightless birds and reptiles roamed, and where deserts and rainforests alternated across vast distances. The scale of adaptation can be measured by the range of environments occupied within a few millennia. From the monsoon forests of New Guinea's north coast to the arid heart of Australia, people spread into regions that demanded very different toolkits. Diets and movement patterns, a testament to flexibility. A lesser-noted observation is that early Sahul sites contain not only evidence of hunting large fauna, but also of careful use of small and reliable resources like yams and fish, suggesting that people quickly balanced riskier big-game pursuits with dependable foods. This diversification may have been crucial in maintaining stable communities in environments so new and unpredictable, yet mysteries remain. Did people play a decisive role in the extinction of Sahul's megafauna, including giant kangaroos, diprotodons, and marsupial lions? Or were these species already vulnerable due to climatic changes? Scholars debate this question intensely, and while some point to the timing of extinctions coinciding with human arrival, others argue that environmental stress was the decisive factor. The truth may lie in the interaction of both. The planetary context emphasizes that Sahul's climates oscillated strongly with glacial cycles, bringing aridity to central Australia and wetter conditions to coasts, meaning that humans arriving there were constantly adjusting to shifting habitats. Such cycles framed encounters with unknown animals not as singular events but as ongoing processes of adaptation. The scale of human imagination required to face these landscapes cannot be overstated. To cross seas into a world of creatures unlike any known before, to recognize which plants were edible, which animals could be hunted, which landscapes held water demanded both caution and experimentation. Each success and failure shaped knowledge passed to the next generation. A lesser-known piece of evidence from cave art in Arnhem Land, though much younger than first arrival, depicts animals long extinct, suggesting that memory of encounters with vanished species persisted in cultural traditions, preserved in stories and paintings across millennia. This continuity implies that early experiences with unknown species left marks not only on diets, but on imaginations. Yet unresolved mysteries endure. How did groups organize hunting in landscapes with prey unfamiliar in size and behavior? What tools did they adapt or invent, and how did these encounters reshape their societies? Without direct evidence of hunting strategies, answers remain speculative, but the stone tools and animal bones preserved in middens confirm that adaptation was swift. The planetary perspective again broadens the picture, just as humans in Europe learned to hunt reindeer and mammoth, and those in the Americas confronted bison and giant sloths. The people of Sahul entered into a dialogue with creatures that had evolved in isolation, and in doing so, they expanded humanity's ecological reach to its widest yet. This demonstrates not only movement across geography but integration into entirely novel biospheres. The scale of impact is profound. Within a few thousand years, people had transformed Sahul's ecological balance, whether by direct hunting, burning landscapes to manage resources, or inadvertently stressing species already vulnerable to climate. The fingerprints of these encounters remain visible in extinction patterns, in changes to vegetation, and in the archaeological record of diets. A lesser-noted implication is that these adaptations likely influenced social structures, for in environments where large game was scarce or unpredictable, cooperation in gathering and fishing may have gained greater emphasis, reshaping community dynamics and cultural practices. Thus, ecological encounters had social as well as biological consequences. Yet mysteries remain about how such changes unfolded, for while bones and charcoal speak of meals and fires, they do not reveal the stories told about animals. The rituals that may have accompanied hunting, or the ways people interpreted the strangeness of their new worlds. The planetary scale underscores again that humans were not passive in these encounters, but active agents in shaping ecosystems, joining the list of evolutionary forces alongside climate tectonics and sea level change. The entry of people into Sahul was as transformative for the continent as the ice ages were for northern lands, a turning point that redefined what species survived and what vanished. Thus, the story of encounters with the unknown is not only one of adaptation but of transformation, for in learning to live among unfamiliar creatures, people also reshaped the landscapes themselves, ensuring that human presence would be written into the ecological history of Sahul as deeply as into its cultural one. A legacy that began the moment boats landed and fires burned on beaches beyond the horizon.